What happens when a CEO orders a burger at his own fast food chain and overhears something that changes everything? Mark Evans, the founder and CEO of a fast-growing regional burger chain with 12 locations, had always prided himself on creating a business where both employees and customers felt valued. But lately, complaints had been piling up online reviews about rude cashiers, long waits, and employees who seemed disengaged. Mark's gut told him something was off, and no amount of filtered reports from his district managers could give him the full picture. So one night, he made a bold decision. He'd go undercover not as an employee but as a regular customer. It wasn't hard to stay anonymous. Most of the staff across his locations had never met him in person. The business had grown so fast that he relied on a team of regional managers to handle day-to-day operations. He swapped his usual sharp suit for a faded hoodie, a baseball cap, and glasses. A scruffy beard he'd been growing for weeks completed the look. Even his closest friends might have done a double take. Now, standing in line at one of his busiest locations, Mark scanned the lobby. The place felt chaotic. Tables were messy, a soda spill near the drink station had gone ignored, and customers were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. His heart sank when he noticed a mother struggling to calm her toddler while waiting far too long for her order. When it was his turn, Mark stepped up to the counter. "What can I get you?" asked the cashier, barely looking up. She was young, maybe early 20s, with earbuds dangling around her neck and an air of disinterest. I'll have the double cheeseburger combo," Mark said, keeping his voice casual. The cashier sighed, punching the order into the register. "Anything else?" "Nope, that's it," he replied, pulling out cash to pay. As she handed him his change, Mark heard her mutter under her breath, loud enough to catch, "God, I hate this job. These idiots can't even decide what they want to order." Mark froze. His eyes flicked to her name tag, Heather. Heather then turned to a coworker behind her, rolling her eyes. "I swear, if one more person asks for extra sauce after I already bagged their order, I'm walking out." The coworker, a young man named Chris, chuckled nervously but didn't respond. He looked uncomfortable, casting a quick glance at the growing line of customers. Mark's stomach tightened. He didn't know what shocked him more, Heather's open frustration, or the fact that no one seemed to be stepping in. He grabbed his receipt and stepped to the side, pretending to wait for his food, but his mind was racing. Was this what his customers experienced every day? Was this the culture he'd accidentally allowed to grow? Nearby, an older employee named Maria was cleaning tables with a quiet efficiency. She noticed the soda spill and immediately rushed to wipe it up before someone slipped. Mark saw her offer a tired but genuine smile to the mother with the toddler, even helping carry her tray to a table. "Thank you so much," the woman said, clearly relieved. "No problem, ma'am," Maria replied, her voice kind but weary. Mark's burger came up, but he wasn't ready to leave. Instead, he found a seat in the corner, eating slowly and watching the team. Heather continued her shift with the same sour attitude, snapping at Chris when he accidentally dropped a fry scoop. "Can you not?" she hissed, loud enough for everyone in the kitchen to hear. Chris apologized softly, his face flushed with embarrassment. By the time Mark left, his heart was heavy. He knew he had to do something, but first, he needed to see if this was an isolated incident or part of a larger problem. That night, Mark made a plan. He'd visit 2 more locations over the next few days, ordering as a customer at each one. If the same issues cropped up, it would confirm his worst fears. The culture in his chain was broken, and it was up to him to fix it. As he drove home, Mark couldn't shake the image of Heather's scowl or Maria's tired smile. One employee was driving customers away, while the other was quietly holding everything together. It was time to find out how deep the cracks really ran. The next morning, Mark walked into one of the chain's suburban locations, a smaller but steady store that had been around since the early days of the company. He ordered a coffee and breakfast sandwich, once again blending in with his hoodie and glasses. The staff here seemed younger, and while the lobby was cleaner than the last location, the energy still felt off. Behind the counter, a tall, wiry man in his late 30s barked orders at the team. His name tag read Steve Manager. Mark noticed immediately that Steve wasn't just firm, he was condescending. "Move faster, people." "We're not running a daycare here," Steve snapped at a teenage girl who was struggling to wrap a breakfast burrito. She flinched at his tone, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to speed up. Mark picked a table near the counter and sipped his coffee, observing. A group of college students waited by the pickup counter, whispering to each other as Steve continued to berate his staff. "Unbelievable," Steve muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some of you can't even handle the simplest tasks." "It's embarrassing." The girl he had yelled at earlier, whose name tag read Jenna, finally stepped away from the kitchen to wipe down tables in the lobby. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped. Mark decided to strike up a conversation. "Hey," he said gently as she cleaned the table next to his. "Busy morning, huh?" Jenna offered a half-hearted smile. "Yeah, it's always like this when Steve's working." Mark raised an eyebrow. "He seems intense." Jenna glanced back toward the counter to make sure Steve wasn't listening. "He's not just intense, he's mean. He's always yelling at us, even when we're doing our best." "I've only been here a few months, but I'm already thinking of quitting." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Most people don't last long with him around." Mark nodded, his chest tightening. "That's tough. Have you tried talking to anyone about it?" Jenna hesitated. "I mean, I've thought about it, but who's going to listen? He's the manager." "He's been here forever." Before Mark could respond, Steve's voice cut through the air again. "Jenna, quit talking and get back to work." "You're not getting paid to chat with customers." Jenna flinched and quickly moved away, her face flushed with embarrassment. Mark clenched his jaw but stayed seated. He needed to see more before stepping in. As the day went on, it became clear that Steve's behavior wasn't a one-off. He scolded the team relentlessly, criticized them in front of customers, and even sighed dramatically when a customer asked for a fresh pot of coffee. But amidst the chaos, Mark noticed another standout employee, a young man named Eric. Eric was polite, quick on his feet, and always had a smile for the customers. When an elderly woman came in confused about the menu, Eric patiently explained the options and even carried her tray to her table. "Thank you, young man," she said, beaming. "No problem at all, ma'am," Eric replied warmly. Mark decided he needed to talk to Eric before leaving. When the lunch rush calmed, he approached him at the drink station. "Hey, Eric," Mark said, pretending to refill his coffee. "You've got great customer service. How long have you worked here?" Eric smiled. "Thanks, it's been about a year now. I really like helping people, but—" He hesitated, glancing toward the counter where Steve was now scrolling through his phone. "It's not always easy with the way things are managed here, you know?" Mark nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Steve's been here a long time and he knows his stuff, but man, he can be rough. I've seen a lot of good people quit because they couldn't handle how he talks to them." Mark's stomach sank. He couldn't let this continue any longer. It was clear that Steve's toxic leadership was driving away both employees and customers. After finishing his coffee, Mark left the restaurant but didn't go far. He parked his car a block away and called his regional manager, Lisa, who oversaw this location. "Hey, Lisa, it's Mark," he said, keeping his tone calm but firm. "I need you to meet me at the suburban store. There's a serious problem we need to address." Lisa arrived within 20 minutes, looking concerned. Mark filled her in on everything he'd observed, from Steve's behavior to Jenna's and Eric's comments. Lisa listened intently, taking notes. This isn't the first complaint I've heard about Steve, she admitted. But he's been with the company for so long, and his numbers are usually solid. Numbers don't mean a thing if the culture is broken, Mark cut in. We're losing good employees because of him. I want to talk to the team myself, but I'll need you to back me up. Lisa nodded. Of course, let's do it. Mark returned to the store with Lisa by his side. This time, he didn't bother staying undercover. He called the team into the break room where they exchanged puzzled glances as he introduced himself. Hi, everyone, Mark began. I'm Mark Evans, the CEO of this company. I've been spending some time in our stores recently, and I've seen some things that concern me. Steve's face went pale. Sir, Mark raised a hand to stop him. We'll get to you in a moment, Steve. First, I want to hear from the rest of the team. Jenna and Eric hesitated at first, but with some encouragement, they opened up about their experiences. Mark listened carefully, taking notes as they described the toxic environment Steve had created. When they finished, Mark turned to Steve. Steve, it's clear to me that your leadership style is causing harm to this team. This isn't the culture I want for my company. I was just trying to keep things running efficiently, Steve protested. There's a difference between being efficient and being disrespectful, Mark replied firmly. I'm sorry, but this behavior isn't acceptable. Effective immediately, you're no longer with this company. Steve's jaw dropped, but he didn't argue. He grabbed his things and left without a word. Mark turned back to the team. I'm sorry it took me this long to see what was happening here. Starting today, things are going to change. Lisa and I will work together to make sure you have the support and leadership you deserve. He looked at Eric. Eric, your dedication to our customers hasn't gone unnoticed. I'd like to offer you a promotion to team lead with a raise to match. Eric's eyes widened. Wow, thank you, sir. I won't let you down. And Jenna, Mark added, I'm sorry for what you've been through. If there's anything you need more hours, schedule adjustments, let Lisa know, and we'll make it happen. Jenna smiled for the first time that day. Thank you, Mr. Evans. As Mark left the store, he felt a mix of relief and determination. There was still work to be done, but this was a start. It was time to rebuild not just the business, but the trust of the people who kept it running. Mark didn't waste any time. After leaving the suburban store, he drove straight to his office and called an emergency meeting with his senior leadership team. Lisa joined him, visibly rattled from the confrontation earlier, and together they laid out the issues they had both witnessed. Mark's voice carried a mix of frustration and determination as he addressed the room. This isn't just about Steve, he said, pacing in front of the table. If this is happening at 2 stores, it's probably happening elsewhere. We've grown too fast and I've lost touch with what's happening on the ground. That's on me. But now that I've seen it, we're going to fix it starting today. The team nodded quietly, but Mark could sense hesitation. Most of them had worked with him for years and weren't used to seeing this side of him, the side that wasn't just focused on growth and expansion, but on people. Lisa, I want you to personally visit every store over the next month, he continued. Talk to the employees, find out what they need, what's working and what isn't, and I mean really listen. No sugarcoating, Lisa agreed, but Mark wasn't done. And we're rolling out mandatory leadership training for every manager starting next week, no exceptions. If they can't lead with respect, they don't belong here. The room fell silent for a moment before one of the regional managers spoke up. What about the stores that are doing well? Shouldn't we focus on recognizing them too? Mark paused, his expression softening. You're right. We need to celebrate the people who are holding this business together. Good employees like Maria and Eric deserve to feel valued, and we've clearly been failing at that. With a plan in place, Mark decided it was time to visit one last store before calling it a day. He wanted to see if the problems he'd uncovered were widespread or isolated. This time, he chose a location in a neighboring city, one of their newer stores with a reputation for high turnover. When Mark walked into the brightly lit restaurant, it was clear that something was different. The staff moved quickly and efficiently, but there was no warmth, no smiles, no small talk. It felt robotic, like everyone was just trying to get through their shift. Mark ordered a grilled chicken sandwich and took a seat near the counter. He noticed a young man named Brian working the register. His movements were stiff, his voice monotone as he rang up customers. A middle-aged woman in line asked if she could substitute a salad for fries, and Brian sighed loudly before cutting her off. "No substitutions," he said flatly, not even looking up. The woman frowned. "But I've done it before, not my problem," Brian interrupted, already moving on to the next customer. Mark watched as the woman walked away, visibly upset. He made a mental note to address Brian's behavior later, but something else caught his eye. In the back of the kitchen, an older man with salt and pepper hair was working 2 stations at once, flipping burgers and assembling orders with remarkable speed. His name tag read Carlos. Despite the fast pace, Carlos seemed to be the only one holding the kitchen together. When the fryer beeped, he dashed over to handle it. When a younger employee struggled to wrap a sandwich, Carlos stepped in with a quick tutorial. "You're doing fine, just tuck the edges tighter," Carlos said, his voice calm and encouraging. "Thanks, Carlos," the younger worker replied, looking relieved. Mark couldn't help but smile. Carlos was clearly a leader, even if he wasn't officially in charge. As the dinner rush began, Mark noticed Brian's attitude only worsened. He sighed, rolled his eyes, and even muttered under his breath when customers took too long to decide. At one point, a father with 2 young kids stepped up to the counter, and Brian practically groaned when the kids couldn't make up their minds. "Can you hurry it up? There's a line," Brian snapped. The father's face turned red as he quickly placed their order, clearly uncomfortable. That was the last straw for Mark. He stood up and walked back to the counter. "Hey, Brian," he said, his tone firm but controlled. "Can I speak with you for a second?" Brian looked up, startled. Sure." Mark led him to a quiet corner of the dining area. "I've been watching how you interact with customers, and it's not okay," Brian shrugged. "I'm just doing my job." "People get annoying, you know? Your job isn't just to take orders, it's to make people feel welcome," Mark said, his voice steady. "If you can't do that, we need to have a serious conversation about whether this is the right role for you." Brian's expression hardened. "Look, I'm not trying to be rude, but it's hard to care when no one here cares about us. We're overworked, understaffed, and underpaid. Maybe if the company treated us better, we'd act better." Mark felt a pang of guilt. Brian's behavior wasn't excusable, but his frustration was valid. "I hear you," Mark said finally. "But taking it out on customers isn't the solution. I'm going to address these issues, but I need you to meet me halfway. Can you do that?" Brian hesitated before nodding reluctantly. "Yeah, okay." Mark returned to his seat, determined to end the day on a positive note. When Carlos finally had a moment to breathe, Mark approached him. "Carlos," he said, extending a hand. "I've been watching you work tonight. You're doing an incredible job." Carlos chuckled, wiping his hands on his apron. "Thanks. Just trying to keep things running smoothly." "You're doing more than that," Mark said. "You're setting an example. How long have you worked here?" "About 6 months," Carlos replied. "I've been in the restaurant business most of my life. Thought I'd slow down a bit, but it's been hectic." "Well, I want you to know your hard work hasn't gone unnoticed," Mark said. "You deserve more support, and I'm going to make sure you get it." Carlos looked surprised but grateful. "Thank you. That means a lot." Mark left the store feeling both encouraged and overwhelmed. The problems ran deeper than he'd realized, but the solutions were clear. It was time to rebuild the company's culture from the ground up, and it started with listening to the people on the front lines. The next morning, Mark walked into the company's headquarters carrying a thick folder of handwritten notes from his undercover visits. He didn't bother with his usual routine of greeting everyone in the office. He went straight to the boardroom and called an all-hands meeting with his senior team, regional managers, and HR department. As everyone settled into their seats, the room buzzed with quiet murmurs. Mark stood at the front, his expression serious but calm. He held up the folder. "This," he began, "is what I've learned about our company over the past few days." The room went silent. "I went undercover," Mark continued, "as a customer at 3 of our stores. What I found was eye-opening. We have incredible employees like Maria, Eric, and Carlos, people who work hard, care about their team, and go above and beyond for our customers. But we've also allowed a culture to grow where some employees feel unsupported, unappreciated, and even disrespected." He paused, scanning the faces in the room. "That's on me. I've been so focused on expansion that I lost sight of what's happening at the ground level. And it's costing us employees, customers, and trust." Lisa, sitting near the front, nodded in quiet agreement. Mark took a deep breath and continued. "Here's what we're going to do," he said, his tone firm. "Effective immediately, we're making changes across the board." He turned to the HR director. "First, we're implementing an anonymous feedback system for employees. I want them to have a direct line to us without fear of retaliation. If something's wrong, we need to know about it." The HR director nodded, scribbling notes. "Second," Mark said, "we're revising our manager training program. Leadership isn't just about hitting numbers. It's about creating an environment where employees feel respected and valued. Any manager who can't meet that standard won't have a place here." He glanced at Lisa. "You'll oversee this personally." "Got it," she replied. "Third," Mark added, "we're introducing a recognition program for outstanding employees. People like Maria, Eric, and Carlos deserve more than just a thank you. They're the backbone of this company, and it's time we show them that." He placed the folder on the table. "And lastly, I'll be visiting every store in person over the next 3 months. No disguises, no filters. I want to hear directly from our employees and customers about what's working and what isn't." The room buzzed with murmurs again, this time with a mix of surprise and approval. Mark raised a hand to quiet them. "This isn't just about fixing problems," he said. "It's about rebuilding trust from the ground up. And that starts now." 2 weeks later, Mark returned to the suburban store where he'd first encountered Steve. The atmosphere was already different. The team looked more relaxed, and Eric, now officially promoted to team lead, was confidently managing the floor. He greeted customers with a warm smile, checked in with his coworkers, and even stepped in to help during a rush. Maria, who had been quietly holding everything together, had been given a raise and additional paid time off. When Mark saw her wiping down tables, he approached her. "Maria," he said, "how's everything been going?" She smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "Much better, Mr. Evans. Thank you for listening to us." "It's the least I could do," Mark replied. "You deserve it." At the location where Carlos worked, Mark found him training 2 new hires. The kitchen was running smoothly, and the team seemed energized. Carlos looked up when he saw Mark and grinned. "Mr. Evans," he said, shaking his hand. "Good to see you again." "You too, Carlos," Mark replied. "How's everything?" Carlos gestured toward the team. "Better than ever. We've got more staff now and everyone's working together. It feels good." Mark nodded. "You've earned it. And I wanted to let you know we're putting you in charge of training new hires across all our locations. You've got a gift for leadership, and I want to make sure others can learn from you." Carlos's eyes widened. "Seriously, wow, thank you. You've earned it," Mark said with a smile. Not everything was easy. At the newer store where Mark had confronted Brian, the changes were slower. Brian had been placed on probation with a clear warning about his attitude. When Mark visited again, Brian was making an effort, but there was still work to do. Mark pulled him aside after observing him for a while. "Brian," he said, "I can see you're trying and I appreciate that, but I need to know, are you committed to improving?" Brian nodded. "Yeah, I am. I know I've got a lot to work on, but I want to get better." "Good," Mark replied. "Keep it up. We'll support you, but the rest is up to you." 3 months later, Mark stood in the same boardroom where he'd first announced the changes. This time, he was surrounded by employees from every store: cashiers, cooks, managers, and more. Maria, Eric, and Carlos were there too, standing near the front. "As of today," Mark said, addressing the group, "we've completed our first round of changes. We've seen higher employee satisfaction, better customer reviews, and a stronger sense of teamwork across the board." The room erupted into applause. "This isn't the end," Mark continued. "It's just the beginning. We're going to keep listening, keep improving, and keep growing together." As the applause grew louder, Mark felt a sense of pride and relief. The past few months had been challenging, but the results were clear. The company was on the right track again. And this time, he wouldn't lose sight of the people who made it all possible.